This morning I'm continuing on with the series of the 10 Commandments called Tuning Up the 10. And this week we are at commandment number 7, Thou shalt not commit adultery. Let us pray. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our strength and our light. Amen. There's a Bible out there called the Sinner's Bible, also known as the Wicked Bible. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Published in 1668, it was a reprint of the King James Version of the Bible with one glaring mistake. The word not had been accidentally left out of the 7th commandment, thus rendering it, Thou shalt commit adultery. When the Archbishop of Canterbury found out about the mistake, he ordered all copies of the Bible destroyed, and there were many of them. And they were, save for a few. There are said to be at least 14 known editions of the Sinner's Bible still circulating in the world. Most are in libraries or museums, but a few are held by collectors and are said to be worth thousands of dollars. So, I'm going to start this sermon with a big sigh. This is a hard one. I prayed all week that I might get laryngitis and would not be able to talk on this topic, but alas, I did not. It's not that it's not an important topic, because it is. But there are a few things that make this difficult. Firstly, I'm British, and we don't talk about these kind of things. We prefer to just avoid them or sweep them under the carpet. And if we do have to talk about them, we tend to blush, so maybe just keep that in mind. But it's more than that. I know what a difficult topic this is for people for a lot of reasons. It's an emotional topic. It's a touchy topic. Anything that gets to the heart of our most intimate relationships brings up all kinds of collateral issues. And we all know the effect that infidelity can have on relationships, marriages, and families. And I know some watching today may know that only too well. And my goal in this series, again, is not to be heavy-handed or make this a guilt trip or open wounds that maybe are just starting to heal. So I'm approaching this topic very sensitively, very cautiously, and I hope very gracefully, recognizing that out of the 10 Commandments, this one, for some, may go the deepest. So bear with me, because I am going to turn this commandment around in a bit and look at it in a different way. But before I get there, I do really need to talk about it as it is. Because to not talk about it is not to honor the commandment. And actually, some of the history and context of this commandment is kind of interesting. At least I think so. And a lot of it's very disturbing. So let me just share a few things about the 7th commandment. The first thing I want to say about the 7th commandment is that we assume that it's a commandment about morality around marriage and sex. And it certainly is, but it's actually more of a commandment that addresses property rights. It's also a commandment, more than any other, that gives us insight into how women were treated in biblical times. You have to remember that at this time in history, in this part of the world, and in this culture, women were deemed the property of men. And it makes me squirm to say that, but it's absolutely the truth. As it says in the Bible, a woman shall be given by her father to her husband, usually with some kind of financial incentive attached. A horrible idea that unfortunately is still symbolically practiced in weddings today in what we call the giving of the bride. It's a part of a wedding that I would happily leave out. As a result of this, you didn't marry for love as much as you married to secure your property rights. It was just as simple as that. Marriage was a business transaction between men. The women were the commodity that was being traded. So when adultery was committed, it wasn't a crime against love or marriage. It was a property crime, and that's how it was prosecuted. How do we know this? Because it was not illegal for a married man to have a relationship with another woman outside of marriage if that woman wasn't married. It was only illegal if the other woman was married. Why? Because then you were stealing another man's property. And as harsh as that sounds to our modern Western ears, that's the way it went. It was a double standard. And it gets much worse. To be proven that an adulterous relationship had occurred, 2 witnesses had to have seen the act take place, which to me sounds crazy. But without that, there was only one other way to prove that it happened, and it was this. If a husband suspected his wife of infidelity, and there was no proof in the form of a witness, she could undergo what was called the ordeal of the bitter water. She would be taken before a priest, who would force her to drink a bitter concoction, which could be made up of whatever the priest wanted to put in it. If the potion did not affect her, in other words, if she did not get sick, she was considered innocent. If she was not innocent, according to this ritual, her stomach would grow, her reproductive organs would burst, and she would become very sick. She would then either die from the poison, or she would die from the punishment of having committed adultery. That was barbaric. It was beyond barbaric. But I want this to sink in for a moment, because one of my purposes in sharing this series is for us to really think again about how we are using the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, to guide our ethical decisions, or whether we really should be at all. I want you to imagine being a woman back then, a wife. You could burn the dinner one day, and your husband decides he doesn't like your cooking and he wants to get back at you. He could accuse you of adultery and force you to drink poison. For you as a woman, there was no recourse to stop it. And for him as a man, there was no consequence for having put you through it. And then there was the punishment. For a man caught in the act of adultery with another man's wife or property, there was a punishment which could include death, but rarely didn't. But for a woman caught in adultery, it was very different. It was always death. A woman caught in adultery would be killed by one of 3 ways: stoning to death, strangulation, or having fire poured down her throat. It's all in the Bible. The way people treated each other, particularly women, was swift and brutal and utterly barbaric. I know this is horrible, but again, that's why we need to be so careful in how we talk about this Old Testament, or in how we take it out of its historical context and try to apply it to the modern world. So adultery in Old Testament times was a property crime, and it was treated as such, and it was prosecuted as such. It had little to do with love. So what about today? Does infidelity happen today? Well, of course it does, and we all know that. But the understanding of it is different, and thus the consequences are different. Marriage today, at least in a Western culture, is not a business transaction. It is an act of mutual love and commitment between 2 equal persons, at least equal under the law, if not in practice. It is 2 people choosing to go through life together and committing fully to each other. So adultery isn't a property violation anymore. It's a violation of trust and love between a couple. It's a private matter. It's not a legal matter. And as such, there are few, if any, legal consequences as a result, especially with no-fault divorce laws. But again, as we know, the very personal consequences can be huge. It's the breaking of a bond of trust, which can be deal-breaking and thus life-changing. And again, for a long time, women bore the brunt of the inequality of this. Particularly for women who, because of inequality in society for so long, were often forced to stay in unhealthy relationships because of a lack of opportunities and thus security for themselves and their children outside of marriage. Thankfully, that is changing. As we move towards greater equity in our Canadian society, and women have access to more opportunities in the workplace and can have financial independence, they are choosing to not stay in relationships that are not good or that are not mutually beneficial. The result? Divorce rates are going up. I think this is an interesting debate. I'm not going to have it here, but I'll throw it out so you can have it at home. And it's this. Are increasing divorce rates proof of the breakdown of the family and the crumbling of morals, as some will say? Or are they a reflection of actually a maturing society that is moving closer to gender equality, i.e., women or men don't have to stay in dysfunctional or dangerous relationships because they are trapped with no options outside of marriage? Woohoo! I'll look forward to getting some emails on that one. And I'm not taking sides. I'm just throwing that debate out there. The point is, even though the context may have changed, infidelity is still considered as harmful and hurtful, whether in ancient biblical times or in modern times. We may have different expectations of it or different consequences for it, but it's still understood as a violation of trust. And unless there's an understanding between a couple as to how they will practice sexuality in their relationship, because some couples choose a model that may be different than what we may choose, unless those expectations have been agreed upon and discussed, the probability of infidelity causing harm, sometimes irreparable harm, is huge. But let me just say this, and then I'll move on to something a little more positive as we tune this one up. I think we should heed Jesus' example in Scripture when he comes across the woman caught in adultery, the story that I just read to you. Because there is so much judgment around this topic. For those in the story with rocks in their hands about to stone her to death, it was very cut and dried. She had broken the rules. She had to pay the consequences. But not so for Jesus. He gets those men, and they would have all been men, to think about times when they fell short, times when they let someone down or let themselves down. And there wasn't a single one among them who hadn't made a mistake, unless they all dropped their rocks and they went home. You don't need me to tell you this because you know it, but let me say it anyway. Relationships are difficult and challenging. There are any number of things that can lead to the breakdown of a relationship. We may see the destination that a couple reaches, but none of us gets to see the journey that led them there. Not a single one of us has a right to sit in judgment over what another couple has gone through. And when a couple is going through a hard time, the last thing they need is someone hurling rocks at them. In fact, I can think of a time when we need more support, care, understanding, and compassion from others than when our primary relationship breaks down. Judgment only deepens the guilt and the grief. But compassion lightens the burden. Understanding and support heals the wound. Just something to keep in mind the next time you might be tempted to pick up a rock. Okay, this is all about tuning up the 10. So, what can we do to this commandment to put a new twist on it? Like I said last week, for the final 5 commandments, which are all thou shalt nots, I want to turn them around and make them thou shalts. So what is the opposite to thou shalt not commit adultery? And no, it's not thou shalt commit adultery, so if that's where you thought this sermon was going, you're going to be disappointed. So what is it? Well, I took a long walk last holiday Monday on that beautiful day to think about this because I really wanted to get it right. So I first had to ask myself the question, what actually is infidelity? And why is it so hurtful and harmful? And I think the answer is, at least for me, is because it is a betrayal of trust. I think more than the act itself, it is the fracturing of that bond of trust that makes it so hard for couples to get over it. Trust is like a bank. We put our money in the bank because we know that it will be safe and we know that it will be well taken care of. But if we discover one day that the bank has squandered or lost all our money, how quick are you going to be to invest in that bank again? Trust in relationships works exactly the same way. Once compromised, it's difficult for us to have faith in it to protect what is most valuable to us. In this case, our hearts. It's not to say that we can't. We can earn the trust back of others if we truly want that to happen. Just like a bank can earn your money back if it restructured itself and proved that it's worthy of your money. But it's difficult to do. So, if adultery is the betrayal of trust, what is the opposite of thou shalt not commit adultery? I believe it's this. Thou shalt strive to be trustworthy. You know what's great about this? Is I can now apply this to all kinds of relationships and I don't have to worry about blushing anymore. Thou shalt strive to be trustworthy. Do you know trustworthy people? What makes them trustworthy? Well, there's lots of answers to that question, but what I did was I took that word trust and I turned it into an acronym. And these are what I believe are the 5 qualities, at least 5 of the qualities of being a trustworthy person. I'm going to put each one on the screen as I share them, so here we go. The T in trust stands for be true to your word. Henry David Thoreau wrote that there are 3 things we need to be true to: our work, our word, and our friends. Or I always like what Confucius had to say on the topic. He said, be sincere and true to your word, serious and careful in your actions, and you will get along even among barbarians. Hopefully no one is living among barbarians, although that may have described some people's home life. Trustworthy people say what they mean, and they mean what they say. If they say they will keep a secret, they will keep a secret. If they say they will get a job done, they will get that job done. You know, working with volunteers, as I do, I know what a treasure it is to find people who are true to their word, even if they don't have the incentive of a paycheck. It's a wonderful quality, and it builds goodwill, and it builds good relationships, and it builds trust. You know, this place that I'm in today wasn't constructed because of the person standing behind the pulpit. It's because of the small army of volunteers over the years who showed up, followed through, and always gave their best, and still do. Trustworthy people are people who are true to their word, and that is so important in a relationship, is being true to our word. How about R? To me, R stands for reliable. A trustworthy person is a reliable person. You can count on them. I was an extremely anxious child growing up. I mean capital A anxious. I mean scared of my shadow anxious. When you are an anxious person, especially as a child, but even as an adult, reliability is something that you cling to like a life raft. Thankfully, I was blessed with parents who were always reliable, almost always reliable. When I was in kindergarten, for example, I didn't want to stay in that classroom because I was so scared. Every day, my mom would bend down to where I was, and then she would look up at the clock on the wall, and she would say to me, when that hand is on that number, and that hand is on that number, I'll be here to pick you up. And then she would leave. And I would spend all day looking at that clock. It was my lifeline. And sure enough, when those hands were exactly where she said they were, there she would be at the door. And that meant everything to me. As a parent, I've tried to model that same characteristic, particularly when my kids were younger. If they had to be somewhere at a certain time or they had to be picked up somewhere at a certain time, I would move heaven and earth to get there because I know how much it meant to me as a child. Reliability in a relationship builds trust as well. And that's more than just being in the right place at the right time. It means that the people closest to you can always count on you, rely on you. In a book called Cross Creek, the author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings shares this cute little dialogue between 2 young friends. This is what she writes. In the village, my friend Mo once said, "Me and her is buddies. If her gate falls down, I go and fix it. If I get in a tight spot for money, she helps me if she's got it. And if she ain't got it, she gets it for me. We stick together. You gotta stick to the bridge that carries you across." You gotta stick to the bridge that carries you across. Be reliable. How about you? To me, you in trust stands for understanding. Again, think about the Bible story this morning that I read. When that woman is about to be stoned to death in the story, Jesus extends to her forgiveness. But before forgiveness, he extends to her understanding. And not only understanding of her, but an understanding of the situation and all those involved. Understanding is a quality that usually precedes forgiveness. Before we can forgive someone, we have to understand them. We have to understand where they're coming from. We have to understand the situation. Trustworthy people take the time to understand what others are going through. They're willing to see things in 3 dimensions. And what I mean by that is they realize things are more complex than they may appear on the surface. One of the terms I love to use is a backstory. Everyone has a backstory. In other words, everyone has a story that people don't see, that is the culmination of where they've come to where they are at that point in time. I have this habit of watching, when I'm watching TV or a movie, is if I see a character that I like, I want to find out their backstory. I want to find out who the actor is that plays them and what that actor's story is. So I'll often get on my phone, I'll go onto Google, and I'll look back at who the actor is and where they came from. And I find knowing that information helps me to enjoy the show even more. I always wondered, what do you think the backstory is of the woman caught in adultery? What led her there? What was her marriage like to her husband? What silent torment could she be suffering from that we know nothing about? Trustworthy people understand that everyone has a backstory. And thus, before rushing to judgment, they take time to dig into that backstory. And that is so true in a relationship as well. When 2 people come together in marriage, they don't come as blank slates. They come into that relationship with a backstory. Understanding those stories is vital to building trust in any kind of a relationship. How about S? S stands for steadfast. That's a word we don't use a lot in our modern language. What does steadfast mean? It means strong, but it means actually more than that. One author put it this way: like a rugged tree, be hard and sound at the core. That is being steadfast, being strong in your core. Trustworthy people know themselves. They know what they believe and why they believe it. They stay true to their core beliefs and they exhibit confidence in them. They let themselves be guided by their core beliefs about justice, compassion, dignity, respect. They are people of character, and as a result, people will put their trust in them. In 1983, the U.S. issued a postage stamp commemorating the building of the first steel bridge in America. It was built across the Mississippi River in St. Louis back in the 1800s. Many said it could not be built, and when it was, everyone said it could never support its own weight. People wouldn't go on the bridge because they didn't trust it. So James Eads, who was the builder, ordered 14 locomotives to stop on the bridge at once. Only then did people trust the bridge. When people see that you are strong at your core, they will know they can trust you with the things that are most valuable to them. Be steadfast. And finally, to be trustworthy is to be willing to trust. A minister tells a cute little story of trying to wash his little son, who was a toddler, to wash his hair in the bath. He would lather the boy's head up with shampoo, and then the little guy would start to cry because he didn't want the shampoo to go in his eyes, and he would naturally look down, and by looking down, that's exactly what happens. The shampoo would come down and go in his eyes. And so his dad would say to him, you gotta look up, keep looking up and you'll be fine. Look into my eyes and you'll be okay. There's nothing to fear. It's a simple little image, but it's so true. When we are fearful or worried, or we feel guilty, or we feel broken, what do? We tend to look down. We lose trust in ourselves. We lose trust in others. In the story of the woman caught in adultery, twice it says, Jesus straightened up. And by doing so, he urged the woman to straighten up from looking at the ground. And when she looked up and she looked into the eyes of Jesus, what did she see? She saw someone who forgave her. She saw someone who understood her. She saw someone willing to give her a second chance. She saw someone who wanted her to move forward and embrace her future. She saw Jesus. But most especially, she saw God. Sometimes it's hard to be a trusting person, to trust in each other, particularly if that trust has been broken. That's why our faith invites us to filter our trust through God. I lift my eyes to the hills, says the psalmist. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord. Our faith always invites us to lift our heads, to lean into the strength and the peace of God. And when we do, what happens? We can find the strength to look to the future. We can trust in the promises of forgiveness and grace. We can extend to another a second chance. We can believe that good can come from anything, even from our worst mistakes. What were the final words that Jesus said to the woman? Go. Go from here. In other words, your future awaits you. Don't let this incident define you. Don't let this incident limit you. Don't let it steal your trust in God or yourself or others, but leave the rocks on the ground and go, because ahead of you could still be the best part of your journey. And the woman left that place and began writing the next chapter of her life. Thou shalt be trustworthy, true to your word, reliable, understanding, steadfast, and trusting. Phew! We made it to the end, and I don't think I even blushed once. You know, I have a colleague in ministry whom I trust and respect a great deal. And I reached out to her at the beginning of this week to say that I was fretting over this sermon because of the topic. And she said to me, never shy away from talking about the tough stuff, because we need to hear that stuff too. And she's right. That's where we learn the most. I so appreciated her sharing that with me. And what is true in writing sermons is true in life. Don't shy away from the tough stuff, the tough conversations, the tough decisions, the tough journeys. For that's how we grow and learn and deepen our experience of life. If you are going through a rough time right now, for whatever reason, first of all, be gentle and understanding with yourself. Don't lose faith, but keep your head up and trust in the promises of the one who long ago restored life to the woman whose very life hung in the balance. For in him we see reflected the God whose love is big enough to draw us in and lift us up, big enough to heal us and to encourage us. Because with God, it's never about throwing rocks. It's always about restoring lives with love. Amen.